Merry Christmas, or rather a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone or belief system. Regardless, we proceed. Today's video has one small, insignificant Christmas detail, hidden somewhere. In the middle, you probably won't notice it or care, but it's there. Much like the faint hope of medieval prisoners who celebrated Christmas in conditions that would make a modern parking ticket seem like a vacation. This may be the most boring video ever made. And yet, here you are. Have you ever wondered how nothing became something, but then went back to being nothing? Because that's essentially what we're about to explore for the next 2 hours. The profound meaninglessness of Christmas joy filtered through stone walls, iron bars, and the administrative tedium of medieval incarceration. If you're expecting entertainment, you've come to the wrong place. If you're expecting sleep, you've come to exactly the right place. If you're expecting both, well, that's philosophically impossible, but we'll attempt it anyway. To understand what Christmas was like in a medieval jail, we must first understand what a medieval jail was like on any other day, which coincidentally was exactly the same. Medieval jails were remarkably consistent in their commitment to being unremarkable. The concept of imprisonment as we know it today didn't exist in the medieval period. This is important, not because it's interesting, but because it establishes a foundation of irrelevance that we'll build upon for the next hour and 59 minutes. Let me introduce you to Aldric of Mundainshire. Aldric was a jailer in the year 1247. He was born, he lived, he died. In between those events, he occasionally opened and closed jail doors. This is his story. Sort of. Aldric's father was also a jailer. His name was also Aldric. Medieval naming. Conventions were as innovative as medieval jail cuisine, which is to say not at all. Aldric Sr. was born in 1201, during the reign of King John, who you may remember as being historically significant for reasons that won't be mentioned here because they have nothing to do with Christmas in jail. The jail where both Aldrics worked was located in what is now a Starbucks parking lot in Kent. The irony writes itself, though we won't explore that irony because irony requires energy, and energy is what we are systematically draining from this narrative. Medieval jails were typically located in the lower floors of castles, town halls, or purpose-built structures that modern architects would describe as aggressively uninspired. The Mundainshire jail was no exception. It had walls, 4 of them in most rooms, sometimes 5, depending on how you counted corners, which no one did because counting corners was not yet a recognized profession. The building materials were local stone, which in Mundainshire meant limestone that was neither particularly lime-like nor particularly stone-like. It was, by all accounts, rock-adjacent material that had been convinced through medieval construction techniques to remain vertically stable for several centuries. Each cell measured approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, though medieval measurements were more suggestions than standards. A medieval foot was based on the actual foot of whoever was doing the measuring, which led to cells that ranged from uncomfortably small to comically inadequate. Aldric Jr. had particularly large feet, size 13 in modern measurements, which meant his cells were spacious by medieval standards and cramped by modern ones. The jail housed an average of 12 prisoners at any given time. Their crimes ranged from debt, the most common, to theft, the second most common, to being in the wrong place at the wrong time while poor, the third most common, though this wasn't technically a crime, just treated like one. Now about Christmas. Christmas in 1247 was not the commercialized holiday we know today. There were no shopping malls because malls had not been invented. There were no Christmas trees because the tradition hadn't migrated to England yet. There were no Christmas cards because cards were expensive, and most people couldn't read anyway. What there was the Feast of the Nativity, a religious observance that involved going to church, eating slightly better food if you could afford it, and pretending to be more charitable than usual for approximately 8 hours. The prisoners in Aldric's jail were not invited to church. This was not out of cruelty, but out of practicality. Medieval church services lasted approximately 4 hours, and leaving prisoners unattended for 4 hours was considered poor jail management, even by medieval standards. Instead, the local priest, Father Benedict, would visit the jail on Christmas morning. Father Benedict was a thin man with a thick accent who spoke Latin fluently and English, as if he'd learned it from someone who'd learned it from someone who'd once met someone who spoke English. Let me describe Father Benedict in detail, because details are what separate truly boring content from merely tedious content. Father Benedict was born in 1198, making him 49 years old in 1247. He had brown hair that was turning grey, brown eyes that remained brown, and a nose that was neither large nor small, but exactly the size you would expect a nose to be if you'd never thought about nose sizes before. He wore the standard Benedictine habit, which was brown. Not chocolate brown, not mahogany brown, not any brown that would have a modern name, just brown. Medieval brown. The color of things that weren't any other color. His shoes were leather, made from cows who had lived unremarkable lives and died unremarkable deaths to become unremarkable footwear. The leather was tanned using oak bark and urine, a detail that's historically accurate, but adds nothing to our understanding of Christmas in jail. Father Benedict carried a wooden cross, carved from ash wood by Brother Marcus, who lived in the monastery and carved wooden crosses because that's what Brother Marcus did. Brother Marcus had been carving wooden crosses for 17 years. He was very good at it, though no one particularly noticed because wooden crosses were not complex artistic endeavors. On Christmas morning, 1247, Father Benedict walked from the monastery to the jail. The distance was 1,247 steps, a number I mention only because it coincidentally matches the year. This coincidence means absolutely nothing, but meaningless coincidences are the backbone of truly boring content. The walk took Father Benedict 23 minutes, during which he thought about various religious matters that we won't explore because they would make this content educational, and education was not the goal. He arrived at the jail at approximately 9:30 a.m., though medieval timekeeping was based on sundials and general guesswork, so approximately was as precise as time got in 1247. Aldrich Jr. greeted Father Benedict at the jail entrance. The greeting consisted of a nod from Aldrich and a slightly deeper nod from Father Benedict. Medieval social protocols were refreshingly simple, much like everything else about medieval life except for the parts that were unnecessarily complicated, which were most of the other parts. "Good morning, Father," said Aldrich in Middle English, which I'll translate to modern English for your convenience, though the translation removes much of the linguistic awkwardness that made medieval conversations sound like everyone had learned to speak from the same poorly written manual. "Good morning, Aldrich," replied Father Benedict in slightly better Middle English, because priests were generally better educated, though not by much. They proceeded into the jail, down a stone staircase that had 12 steps. I'm mentioning the number of steps because counting things is a reliable way to fill time in boring content, and we have approximately 1 hour and 35 minutes remaining. The staircase led to a corridor with 6 cells, 3 on each side. The cells were numbered, though medieval numbering was more like medieval measuring, more of a suggestion than a system. The cells were identified as first cell, second cell, third cell, other cell, the one next to other cell, and cell where. Something happened once. We'll visit each cell and meet each prisoner, not because their stories are interesting, but because we have time to fill, and visiting cells is a methodical way to fill it. Before we continue our descent into the administrative details of medieval Christmas incarceration, let me tell you about something slightly less boring than this. A video, but not by much. In the spirit of this painfully slow Christmas content, I've created something special for those of you who appreciate the art of extreme tedium. The boring Christmas calendar, featuring our character and friend, Sleepy Noel. This calendar contains 31 days. Yes, 31, because even boring calendars can't follow conventional logic, each featuring a different, effortless expression from Sleepy Santa. Access this exclusive product via the pinned link in the comments. These improvised lyrics constituted defamation of character, a more serious offense than public drunkenness, because medieval society took reputation very seriously, especially the reputation of wealthy and powerful individuals like Sir Geoffrey, who had the authority to impose severe punishments on anyone who publicly insulted them. Sir Geoffrey had not personally witnessed Peter's performance, but several witnesses reported the content of Peter's songs, including specific lyrics that questioned Sir Geoffrey's legitimacy, intelligence, and personal hygiene. Medieval defamation law held that damaging someone's reputation was equivalent to damaging their property, because reputation was essential for conducting business and maintaining social standing. Peter's trial was scheduled for December 20th, 5 days before Christmas, but was postponed because Sir Geoffrey was occupied with other judicial matters, including a land dispute between two farmers who disagreed about the location of their property boundary, a disagreement that had been ongoing for 3 years and showed no signs of resolution. This meant that Peter would remain in jail over Christmas, serving an indefinite sentence for crimes that included public intoxication, disturbing the peace, and defaming Sir Geoffrey's character. Though the specific penalties for these crimes were unclear because medieval legal codes were more like guidelines than comprehensive statutes, Peter had been in jail for 25 days when Christmas arrived, during which time he had sobered up completely and developed a much clearer understanding of the legal consequences of alcohol-impaired decision-making, though this understanding came too late to prevent his current predicament. Now, let me describe the one next to other cell which contained Agnes the vagrant. Agnes had been arrested for vagrancy, which in medieval terms meant being poor without a permanent residence and visible means of support, conditions that described a significant portion of the medieval population but were selectively prosecuted, based on various factors including local economic conditions and the personal preferences of law enforcement officials. But first, let me explain medieval social welfare systems, because understanding how medieval society handled poverty helps explain why being poor was sometimes treated as a criminal offense, though explaining medieval poverty has minimal relevance to Christmas celebrations. But we've established a pattern of comprehensive background explanations that we must maintain for consistency. Medieval England had no formal social welfare system comparable to modern unemployment benefits, food assistance, or housing programs. Poor relief was provided primarily through religious institutions, which operated on charitable donations and had limited resources that were insufficient to address the widespread poverty that characterized medieval society. The Church encouraged charity as a religious duty, and wealthy individuals sometimes provided assistance to the poor as a way of demonstrating their piety and improving their chances of salvation. But charitable giving was voluntary and inconsistent, creating a system where poor people's survival depended on the generosity of individuals who had no obligation to be generous. Most poor people managed to survive through a combination of occasional labor, begging, assistance from family members, and various forms of informal support from their local communities. However, this system only worked for people who had established connections to specific communities and could demonstrate that they belonged somewhere, even if they couldn't afford to live there comfortably. Agnes's problem was that she had no established community connections and therefore no access to informal support networks that kept other poor people from being classified as vagrants. She had been born in a village that was destroyed during a conflict between local nobles, a conflict that had nothing to do with the village, but resulted in the village being burned down because medieval warfare often involved destroying civilian property to weaken enemy economic resources. The destruction of Agnes's village had occurred when she was 16 years old, forcing her to leave the only community she had ever known and search for survival opportunities elsewhere. She had spent the next 12 years traveling between different towns and villages, working temporary jobs when available, and begging when work was unavailable. This pattern of movement between communities made Agnes suspicious to local authorities, who were concerned about strangers who might be criminals, spies, or carriers of diseases, though Agnes was none of these things, just someone whose original community had been destroyed through circumstances beyond her control. Agnes had arrived in Mundaneshire in early November, hoping to find work helping with autumn farm tasks like harvesting crops and preparing livestock for winter. However, most farmers had already completed their harvest and had no need for additional workers, especially workers with no local references or established reputation for reliable work. She had tried begging, but Mundanesia was a small town with limited economic resources, and the local residents had little extra money to give to strangers, especially during autumn when they were preparing for winter expenses and needed to conserve their own resources. After 2 weeks of unsuccessful job searching and minimal income from begging, Agnes had begun sleeping in a barn owned by farmer Benedict, who was not related to Father Benedict but shared the same first name. She had not asked permission to sleep in the barn because she assumed that Farmer Benedict would refuse permission, and sleeping outdoors in November was dangerous due to cold weather conditions that could result in serious illness or death. Agnes was discovered in the barn by Farmer Benedict on November 28th, when he went to check on his livestock and found her sleeping in the hay storage area. Farmer Benedict was not particularly angry about the unauthorized use of his barn, but was concerned about the legal implications of allowing a vagrant to live on his property without reporting the situation to local authorities. Medieval property laws held landowners responsible for activities that occurred on their property, including criminal activities committed by people who were living on the property without permission. This meant that Farmer Benedict could potentially be held liable if Agnes committed crimes while living in his barn, even though Agnes had no history of criminal behavior and no intention of committing crimes. Farmer Benedict reported Agnes's presence to Aldrich Jr., who was required to investigate reports of vagrancy because vagrancy was considered a threat to public order, though the specific threat was unclear and seemed to be based more on theoretical concerns than actual problems caused by vagrants. Aldrich interviewed Agnes and determined that she had no permanent residence, no regular employment, and no local family or community connections that would provide support if she became ill or destitute. These circumstances met the legal definition of vagrancy, regardless of Agnes's character or intentions, because vagrancy laws were based on objective conditions rather than subjective assessments of individual worthiness. Agnes was arrested on November 28th and brought before Sir Geoffrey for trial. The trial consisted of Sir Geoffrey confirming that Agnes met the legal criteria for vagrancy and explaining that vagrants were required to leave town within 24 hours or face imprisonment, because allowing vagrants to remain in town would encourage other vagrants to come to Mundanesia, potentially overwhelming local resources and creating public order problems. Agnes explained that she had nowhere to go and no resources for traveling to other towns, but Sir Geoffrey noted that these problems were exactly why vagrancy was illegal, because people without resources or destinations were likely to become permanent burdens on local communities that couldn't afford to support additional poor people. The sentence was imprisonment until Agnes could demonstrate that she had secured employment and housing, or until she could be transported to another town that was willing to accept responsibility for her welfare, though no other towns had expressed interest in accepting responsibility for vagrants from Mundanesia, creating a system where vagrant imprisonment was effectively indefinite. Agnes had been in jail for 27 days when Christmas arrived, during which time no progress had been made in finding alternative solutions to her vagrancy problem, because medieval social services were limited and mostly focused on local residents who had established community connections. Finally, let me describe the cell where something happened once, which contained Harold the Confused. Harold had been arrested for unknown reasons that no one could clearly explain, including Harold himself, Aldrich Jr., and Sir Geoffrey, creating a legal situation that was confusing even by medieval standards, which were notably tolerant of confusion in legal matters. The confusion began on November 20th, when Harold was found standing in the market square holding a rope and looking bewildered. Several witnesses reported that Harold seemed lost and was asking directions to places that didn't exist, including the Blue Cow Tavern and Smithfield Market, though Mundanesia had no tavern called the Blue Cow and no market called Smithfield. Harold appeared to be approximately 60 years old, had grey hair and brown eyes like most elderly people in medieval England, and wore clothes that were worn but not torn, suggesting that he wasn't destitute but also wasn't wealthy. His most distinctive feature was his expression of constant confusion, as if he was trying to remember something important but couldn't quite recall what it was. When questioned by concerned residents, Harold provided answers that were coherent, but didn't correspond to reality. He claimed to be looking for his son Thomas, who worked as a blacksmith at the Blue Cow Tavern, though combining blacksmithing with tavern operation was an unusual business model that didn't exist in Mundaneshire or any nearby towns. Harold also claimed to live in a house on Mill Street with his wife Martha and their 3 grandchildren. But Mill Street had only 4 houses, and the residents of all 4 houses were known to everyone in town, and none of them were named Harold, or had wives named Martha, or grandchildren matching Harold's descriptions. The rope Harold was carrying added to the mystery, because he claimed it belonged to Thomas the blacksmith at the Blue Cow Tavern and needed to be returned immediately. Though the rope appeared to be ordinary rope, with no special characteristics that would make it particularly valuable or important to return urgently. Aldrich Jr. was summoned to investigate Harold's situation, because standing in the market square looking confused while holding rope and asking for directions to non-existent places was unusual enough to warrant official attention, though it wasn't clear whether Harold's behavior constituted a crime or just a medical condition. The investigation revealed that no one in Mundaneshire recognized Harold or knew where he had come from, though several people thought he looked familiar but couldn't remember where they might have seen him previously. This suggested that Harold might be from a nearby town, but had become lost or confused about his location. Aldrich expanded his investigation to include neighboring towns, sending messages to constables in surrounding areas to ask whether anyone was missing a confused elderly man, matching Harold's description. The responses indicated that no one had reported Harold missing, though medieval communication systems were slow and unreliable, so it was possible that missing person reports had been sent but hadn't arrived yet. Meanwhile, Harold remained in the market square, continuing to ask for directions to non-existent places and insisting that he needed to return the rope to Thomas the blacksmith. His persistence suggested that he genuinely believed his story, rather than deliberately providing false information, but his beliefs didn't correspond to observable reality. The situation became more complicated when Harold began displaying signs of agitation, pacing around the market square and muttering about being late for an appointment with Father Marcus at the monastery, though the local monastery had no priest named Father Marcus, only Father Benedict, who didn't recognize Harold and had no scheduled appointments with elderly men carrying rope. Harold's agitation attracted attention from market vendors and shoppers who were concerned that he might be suffering from some form of mental affliction that could make him unpredictable or potentially dangerous, though Harold showed no signs of violent behavior, only confusion and increasing anxiety about his inability to find the people and places he was looking for. Sir Geoffrey was consulted about Harold's situation because unusual legal situations required decisions from the highest local authority, and Harold's case was definitely unusual. Sir Geoffrey examined Harold personally and determined that Harold was either suffering from mental confusion or was deliberately pretending to be confused for reasons that weren't clear. Medieval medical knowledge didn't include detailed understanding of conditions that modern medicine would recognize as dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or other forms of cognitive impairment that could cause Harold's symptoms. Medieval physicians understood that elderly people sometimes became forgetful or confused, but attributed these conditions to humoral imbalances rather than neurological disorders. Sir Geoffrey's decision was to place Harold in jail for his own safety and the safety of others, because releasing a confused person with no known residence or family connections could result in Harold wandering off and becoming lost in the countryside, where he could die from exposure or other dangers, creating liability for local authorities, who had failed to provide adequate care. The imprisonment was classified as protective custody rather than punishment for criminal activity, though the practical result was the same. Harold was locked in a jail cell indefinitely, with no clear criteria for release, beyond the vague hope that his confusion would resolve, or that someone would come forward to claim responsibility for his care. Harold had been in jail for 35 days when Christmas arrived, during which time his confusion had neither improved nor worsened, but had remained consistently inconsistent, with Harold continuing to ask about people and places that didn't exist while demonstrating normal cognitive function in other areas, like remembering to eat meals and following simple instructions. The rope Harold had been carrying was stored with his other possessions, which included a leather pouch containing 3 copper coins, a wooden comb with several broken teeth, and a small piece of cloth that might have been part of a larger garment, but was too small to identify conclusively. These possessions provided no clues about Harold's identity or origin, because they were the kind of generic items that could belong to almost anyone in medieval England. Now, you might be wondering what happened on Christmas morning when Father Benedict arrived to provide spiritual comfort to these 6 prisoners. And I promise you, what happened was exactly as unremarkable as you would expect from a medieval Christmas morning in jail. But we'll build up to that moment with the kind of deliberate pacing that makes watching paint dry seem exciting by comparison. But first, we must discuss the Christmas preparations that had taken place in the jail during the preceding week. Preparations that were so minimal they barely qualified as preparations at all, yet somehow managed to consume considerable time and effort from people who had very little time and effort to spare. The preparations began on December 18th, when Aldrich Jr. received official instructions from Sir Geoffrey regarding Christmas observances for prisoners. These instructions were delivered by Geoffrey's clerk, a thin man named Simon, who had learned to write by practicing letter formation on pieces of wood using charcoal, because paper was expensive, and Simon's family couldn't afford to waste paper. On handwriting practice, Simon the clerk had transcribed Sir Geoffrey's instructions onto a piece of parchment, using ink made from oak galls and iron sulfate, a recipe that produced serviceable but not particularly durable ink that would fade over time, making the instructions temporarily permanent, which was appropriate for instructions that were only relevant for one Christmas season. The instructions specified that prisoners should be allowed to attend a brief religious service on Christmas morning, conducted by Father Benedict, as long as security could be maintained and the service didn't interfere with normal jail operations. Though normal, jail operations on Christmas morning were minimal because most people had the day off from work, including people whose work involved supervising prisoners. The instructions also specified that prisoners should receive slightly better food on Christmas Day, consisting of bread made from wheat flour rather than barley flour, plus a small portion of meat if available, though the availability of meat depended on the jail budget, which was limited, and the local meat supply, which was also limited because medieval meat preservation techniques required significant advance planning. Aldrich Jr. read these instructions carefully and began planning Christmas modifications to the jail routine, though modifying jail routines required coordination with Martha the jail baker, who would need to bake different bread, and with the local butcher, who would need to provide meat portions for 6 prisoners, assuming he had enough meat in stock and could spare it for prisoners who couldn't pay market prices. The coordination process took several days because medieval communication was slower than modern communication, and because Martha the jail baker needed time to acquire wheat flour, which was more expensive than barley flour and not normally kept in stock for jail food preparation, since jail food budgets were designed around the cheapest possible ingredients that still qualified as edible. Martha had to negotiate with Thomas the miller, who ground grain into flour using the mill owned by Sir Geoffrey to process wheat into flour specifically for Christmas jail bread. This negotiation was complicated by the fact that Thomas the miller usually processed barley for jail bread, and switching to wheat required adjusting the mill settings, which was time-consuming and slightly more difficult than processing barley. Thomas, the miller, agreed to process wheat for Christmas jail bread, but charged a premium price because special orders were more expensive than routine processing, and because Christmas wheat processing would delay other customers who had scheduled regular grain processing appointments, creating inconvenience that needed to be compensated through higher prices. The additional cost of wheat flour for Christmas jail bread was approximately 3 pence more than the usual cost of barley flour, which represented a 25% increase in bread costs for one day, a significant expense for a jail budget that was calculated based on providing minimal nutrition at minimal cost throughout the year. Aldrich Jr. had to request approval from Sir Geoffrey for the additional expense, because jail budgets were controlled by local authorities who needed to approve expenditures that exceeded normal operating costs. Even expenditures that were specifically authorized by those same authorities through Christmas instructions that seemed to require spending money that hadn't been budgeted for Christmas modifications. Sir Geoffrey approved the additional expense, but noted that it would be deducted from the jail budget for January, meaning that January meals would need to be even cheaper than usual to compensate for the Christmas upgrade, creating a system where prisoners would pay for their Christmas meal improvements through subsequent meal reductions, though the prisoners weren't consulted about this trade-off. While Aldrich Jr. was coordinating bread improvements, he also needed to arrange for meat portions, which required negotiating with Edmund the Butcher, who was not related to Edmund the farm worker or Farmer Edmund, but shared the same first name because medieval naming conventions were limited, and Edmund was a popular name that appeared frequently in small communities. Edmund the Butcher operated a shop on Butcher Street, which was named with the same creative flair as other streets in Mundaneshire. His shop contained a large wooden table where he cut meat, several hooks for hanging carcasses, and a collection of sharp knives that were essential for butchering, but also made his shop seem vaguely threatening to customers who weren't accustomed to seeing large quantities of sharp metal tools in commercial establishments. The meat available for purchase was primarily pork and beef because pigs and cattle were the most common livestock in the area, though the quality and freshness of available meat varied depending on when animals had been slaughtered and how effectively the meat had been preserved using medieval preservation techniques that involved salt, smoke, and cold storage in underground. Sellers Aldrich Jr. explained to Edmund the Butcher that he needed 6 small portions of meat for Christmas dinner for prisoners, emphasizing that the portions should be small because the jail budget was limited and prisoners didn't require large meat servings to satisfy the Christmas instruction requirements. Edmund the Butcher had several types of meat available, including fresh pork from a pig that had been slaughtered 2 days earlier, beef that had been preserved with salt for several weeks, and various organ meats that were less expensive than muscle meat, but were still considered acceptable for prisoner meals, since prisoner meal standards were lower than standards for paying customers. The negotiation focused on price and portion size because Aldrich Jr. wanted to minimize expense while Edmund the Butcher wanted to maximize profit, creating a typical commercial negotiation that was complicated by the fact that neither party had extensive experience with providing meat for Christmas prison meals, since Christmas prison meat provisions were not a regular part of either person's business activities. They eventually agreed on 6 portions of salted beef, each weighing approximately 4 ounces at a total cost of 8 pence, which was expensive relative to normal jail food costs, but reasonable compared to retail meat prices for individual consumers, though the prisoners weren't paying for the meat directly, so market prices were less relevant than budget impact on jail operations. The beef portions would be prepared by boiling them in water with salt and herbs to make them more palatable and easier to digest, though medieval cooking techniques were limited, and boiled, salted beef was not known for its flavor or texture, but was considered adequate nutrition for people whose food expectations had been calibrated by months of eating bread and gruel. With bread and meat arrangements complete, Aldrich Jr. needed to coordinate Father Benedict's Christmas morning visit, which required confirming that Father Benedict would be available on Christmas morning and establishing a schedule that would accommodate both religious observance and jail security procedures. Father Benedict was contacted through Brother Marcus, who lived at the monastery and served as an intermediary for communication between the monastery and the outside world, because Father Benedict was often occupied with religious duties that prevented him from responding immediately to messages from local authorities. Brother Marcus confirmed that Father Benedict would be available for a Christmas morning jail visit, but noted that the timing would need to be flexible because Christmas morning religious services at the monastery were more elaborate than usual and might run longer than scheduled, creating potential delays that could affect the jail visit schedule. The proposed schedule called for Father Benedict to arrive at the jail at approximately 10 a.m., conduct a brief religious service for the prisoners, and depart by 11 a.m., allowing prisoners to eat their Christmas meal at approximately 11:30 a.m., which was later than the usual meal schedule but still within reasonable bounds for people, whose time was not particularly structured anyway. This schedule required Aldrich Jr. to modify normal jail routines by unlocking all cells simultaneously to allow prisoners to gather in the main corridor for the religious service, which created security concerns because medieval jail security was based on keeping prisoners separated rather than congregating them in groups where they could potentially coordinate escape attempts or other disruptive activities. To address security concerns, Aldrich Jr. planned to position himself at the jail entrance during the religious service, blocking the only exit route while remaining close enough to intervene if any prisoners behaved inappropriately during Father Benedict's visit. Though the specific nature of inappropriate behavior during religious services was unclear and would need to be assessed based on circumstances, the security plan also involved keeping prisoners' hands visible during the service by requiring them to hold wooden crosses that Brother Marcus would provide, ensuring that prisoners' hands were occupied with religious objects rather than potential weapons or tools that could be used for escape attempts, though the jail cells contained no obvious materials that could be fashioned into weapons or escape tools. Brother Marcus agreed to provide 6 wooden crosses for the Christmas service, crosses that he had carved himself using ash wood from trees that grew near the monastery, because carving wooden crosses was Brother Marcus's primary responsibility, and he had accumulated a surplus of crosses that were suitable for special occasions like Christmas jail visits. The crosses were simple in design, consisting of 2 pieces of ash wood joined at right angles using wooden pegs and animal glue, because elaborate decorative crosses required carving skills and time that Brother Marcus didn't have, and because simple crosses were more appropriate for prisoners than ornate religious artifacts that might be too valuable to entrust to people who were in jail for crimes involving theft. With all Christmas preparations arranged, Aldrich Jr. created a written schedule that detailed the timing and logistics of Christmas morning activities, though the schedule was more of a guideline than a rigid plan, because medieval planning was necessarily flexible due to the unpredictability of transportation, communication, and various other factors that could affect scheduled activities. The written schedule was created on a piece of parchment using the same ink and writing materials that Simon the clerk had used for Sir Geoffrey's original instructions, because consistency in record-keeping was important for administrative purposes. Even though the records were unlikely to be consulted by anyone other than Aldrich Jr. himself, the schedule specified that prisoners would be awakened at 8 a.m., provided with their usual breakfast at 8:30 a.m., allowed to wash their hands, and faces at 9 a.m. given their wooden crosses at 9:30 a.m., assembled for the religious service at 10 a.m., returned to their cells at 11 a.m., and served their Christmas meal at 11:30 a.m., creating a structured timeline that would transform Christmas morning from an ordinary jail day into a special occasion with religious and culinary modifications. However, creating a schedule and executing a schedule were different activities, and medieval execution of planned activities was often complicated by factors that hadn't been anticipated during the planning process, factors that we'll explore in detail when we finally describe what actually happened on Christmas morning, though that description is still several minutes away because we haven't finished establishing all the relevant background context. The background context includes weather conditions on Christmas morning, which were cold but not snowing, with overcast skies that provided natural lighting that was adequate for indoor activities but not particularly cheerful, creating an atmospheric backdrop that matched the general mood of Christmas morning in jail, which was neither festive nor depressing, but somewhere in the middle range of emotional experiences. The temperature was approximately 35 degrees Fahrenheit, which was cold enough to require keeping the jail doors closed to prevent heat loss but not cold enough to create serious health risks for prisoners, who were provided with straw for bedding and woolen blankets that were adequate for surviving winter nights in unheated stone buildings, though comfort was not a priority in medieval jail design. The overcast sky meant that natural lighting inside the jail was dimmer than usual, requiring the use of candles or oil lamps to provide adequate illumination for reading religious texts during Father Benedict's service, though medieval religious services often relied more on spoken prayers and familiar songs than on reading, because many participants couldn't read anyway. Aldrich Jr. had prepared for potential lighting needs by acquiring 3 candles made from tallow, which was rendered animal fat that burned with a smoky flame and produced a distinctive odor that most people found unpleasant but tolerable, because tallow candles were the most affordable form of artificial lighting available to people with limited budgets. The candles were positioned in the main corridor where the religious service would take place, providing enough light for Father Benedict to read from his prayer book, while allowing prisoners to see each other's faces during prayers. Though seeing each other's faces wasn't particularly important for religious observance, but contributed to the communal atmosphere that medieval religious services were designed to create. With all preparations complete, Christmas morning arrived, with the kind of mundane inevitability that characterizes most significant events, which seem important in anticipation, but often prove to be remarkably similar to ordinary events once they actually occur, though the anticipation itself had provided some variety to the routine existence of prisoners, who had very little variety in their daily experiences. And now, after extensive preparation and detailed background explanation, we can finally describe what happened when Father Benedict arrived at the jail on Christmas morning, 1247, to conduct a religious service for 6 prisoners whose crimes and circumstances you now understand in comprehensive detail. Father Benedict arrived at approximately 10:15 a.m., 15 minutes later than scheduled, because the Christmas morning service at the monastery had indeed run longer than expected, though the delay was not excessive by medieval standards, where punctuality was more of an aspiration than an expectation, and 15-minute delays were considered minor inconveniences. Rather than serious disruptions, he was carrying his wooden cross, his prayer book, and a small leather bag containing communion wafers that he had prepared for the prisoners, though providing communion to prisoners was not specifically mentioned in Sir Geoffrey's instructions, and represented Father Benedict's personal initiative to make the Christmas service more meaningful for people whose Christmas experiences were necessarily limited by their circumstances. Aldrich Jr. unlocked the jail entrance and greeted Father Benedict with the same nod that had characterized their previous interactions, because their professional relationship was cordial but not particularly warm, reflecting the general medieval approach to interpersonal relationships, which prioritized functional cooperation over emotional connection, especially in professional contexts. "Good morning, Father," said Aldrich Jr., using the same greeting he had used during Father Benedict's previous visits, because consistency in social interactions was valued in medieval culture, and changing greetings without specific reasons for change would have seemed strange or potentially significant. "Good morning, Aldrich," replied Father Benedict, also using the same greeting format as previous visits, demonstrating that both men understood and appreciated consistent social protocols that eliminated uncertainty about appropriate behavior during formal interactions. They proceeded down the 12-step stone staircase to the jail corridor, where the 6 prisoners were already assembled as planned, each holding a wooden cross provided by Brother Marcus, and standing in a line that extended from the first cell to the cell where something happened once, creating a formation that allowed Father Benedict to address all prisoners simultaneously while maintaining visual contact with each individual. The prisoners looked exactly as you would expect people to look after spending several weeks in medieval jail, somewhat thinner than when they arrived, pale from limited sunlight exposure, and wearing clothes that were wrinkled and stained but not torn or completely dirty, because medieval prisoners were allowed to maintain basic hygiene and clothing care as long as they didn't cause problems. For jail staff, William the Debtor stood first in line, holding his wooden cross with both hands and maintaining the posture he had learned during childhood religious instruction, because religious posture was taught to children as part of basic social education and remained consistent throughout people's lives regardless of their subsequent legal problems. Margaret the Thief stood second, also holding her cross with both hands, but fidgeting slightly, because she had nervous energy that was difficult to contain during formal situations, though she was trying to demonstrate appropriate respect for the religious service, because showing Respect during religious observances was important for maintaining good relationships with jail staff and local authorities. Robert the Unlucky stood third in line, holding his cross securely and focusing his attention on Father Benedict, with the concentration of someone who genuinely appreciated any break from the routine of jail life. Even religious services that he attended more from boredom than from spiritual conviction, though spiritual conviction and boredom were not mutually exclusive motivations for religious participation. Peter the Drunk stood fourth, looking more alert and focused than he had since his arrest, because sobriety had improved his ability to concentrate and participate in activities that required attention and appropriate behavior, though he remained somewhat nervous about potential additional legal consequences if he said or did anything that could be interpreted as disrespectful during the religious service. Agnes the Vagrant stood fifth in line, holding her cross with obvious reverence, because religious faith had provided comfort and hope during difficult periods in her life, including her current imprisonment, and she genuinely looked forward to religious services as opportunities to connect with spiritual beliefs that helped her cope with circumstances beyond her control. Harold the Confused stood last in line, holding his cross but looking around the corridor with the same bewildered expression that had characterized his behavior since his arrest, though he seemed to understand that he was participating in a religious ceremony and was making an effort to behave appropriately, even though he remained unclear about where he was and why he was there. Father Benedict surveyed the assembled prisoners and began the service with a Christmas greeting that was traditional for religious observances, but sounded somewhat formal and distant in the stone corridor of a medieval jail, where acoustics were poor, and the atmosphere was more institutional than spiritual. "Peace be with you on this holy day of our Lord's birth," said Father Benedict, using Latin phrases that he translated into Middle English for the benefit of prisoners who were unlikely to understand Latin, though his Middle English was heavily accented and some prisoners had difficulty understanding his pronunciation of words that were already challenging in their medieval forms. "Peace be with you, Father," replied the prisoners in unison, using a response they had learned during childhood religious instruction and remembered despite years of infrequent church attendance, because basic religious responses were deeply embedded in medieval cultural education and remained accessible even to people whose lives had diverged from regular religious practice. Father Benedict opened his prayer book and began reading prayers that were appropriate for Christmas morning, prayers that focused on themes of hope, redemption, and divine mercy, themes that were particularly relevant for prisoners who had limited control over their circumstances and needed spiritual comfort more than theological instruction or moral correction. The prayers were read in Middle English rather than Latin, because Father Benedict understood that his audience needed practical spiritual comfort rather than formal liturgical precision, and Middle English prayers were more likely to be understood and appreciated by prisoners whose educational backgrounds were limited and whose current situations created barriers to complex theological engagement. As Father Benedict read the prayers, the prisoners listened with varying degrees of attention and understanding, but all maintained respectful postures and appropriate expressions because they understood that the religious service was a privilege that could be withdrawn if they behaved inappropriately, and because most medieval people had been taught to show respect during religious observances, regardless of their personal beliefs or circumstances. The service continued with familiar hymns that Father Benedict began singing, and the prisoners joined when they recognized the melodies. Though medieval hymns were not known for their musical complexity, and most people could participate in group singing, even if they couldn't read music or remember all the words to every verse. The hymns created a sense of communal participation that contrasted with the isolation and individual focus that characterized most aspects of jail life, giving prisoners an opportunity to experience shared activity that connected them to religious traditions and to each other in ways that their criminal circumstances and prison sentences had temporarily interrupted. After the hymns, Father Benedict offered communion to prisoners who wished to receive it, explaining that communion was available but not required, because medieval religious practice recognized that different individuals had different relationships with formal religious sacraments and forcing religious participation was less effective than encouraging voluntary spiritual engagement. All 6 prisoners accepted communion, receiving small wafers that Father Benedict had prepared using wheat flour and holy water, wafers that were blessed according to religious traditions and represented spiritual nourishment that supplemented the physical nourishment that prisoners would receive through their Christmas meal later in the morning. The communion distribution required Father Benedict to approach each prisoner individually, creating personal interactions that allowed him to offer brief words of encouragement or comfort tailored to each person's situation, though he was careful not to provide specific advice about legal matters or make promises about outcomes that were beyond his authority to guarantee. To William the debtor, Father Benedict said, "May God provide for your needs and guide you toward resolution of your difficulties," acknowledging William's financial problems while offering hope for future improvement without making specific predictions about when or how William's legal situation might be resolved. To Margaret the thief, Father Benedict said, "May God forgive your mistakes and help you make better choices in the future," focusing on themes of forgiveness and personal improvement rather than judgment or condemnation, because spiritual counseling was more effective when it emphasized positive possibilities rather than past failures. To Robert the unlucky, Father Benedict said, "May God reveal the truth and protect the innocent," acknowledging Robert's claim of innocence while recognizing that legal truth and spiritual truth were sometimes different concepts that needed to be addressed through different approaches and different timelines. To Peter the drunk, Father Benedict said, "May God grant you wisdom and self-control," addressing Peter's alcohol-related problems while avoiding specific references to Peter's defamatory comments about Sir Geoffrey, because religious counseling focused on personal spiritual development rather than specific legal or social conflicts. To Agnes the vagrant, Father Benedict said, "May God provide you with a home and community where you can serve others," acknowledging Agnes's homelessness while emphasizing her potential for positive contributions to society rather than focusing on her current status as a burden on local resources. To Harold the confused, Father Benedict said, "May God bring clarity to your mind and peace to your heart," addressing Harold's cognitive difficulties with compassion and hope while avoiding medical diagnoses or predictions that were beyond medieval religious understanding and Father Benedict's professional expertise. Each prisoner thanked Father Benedict for his individual attention and spiritual guidance, though their expressions of gratitude were brief because medieval social protocols discouraged lengthy conversations during formal religious ceremonies, and because prisoners understood that showing excessive emotion or making personal requests might be interpreted as inappropriate behavior. The service concluded with a final prayer that Father Benedict offered for all prisoners collectively, asking for divine blessing on their Christmas celebration and divine guidance for their future circumstances, whatever those circumstances might prove to be, because medieval religious practice recognized that human planning was limited and divine. Providence operated according to principles that people couldn't fully understand or control. May the Lord, who was born in humble circumstances, understand your difficulties and provide comfort for your suffering, Father Benedict prayed, drawing connections between the Christmas story and the prisoner's experiences while maintaining appropriate theological perspective about the differences between divine incarnation and human criminal justice. The prisoners responded, "Amen," in unison, ending the religious service and creating a transition to the next phase of Christmas morning activities, which would involve returning to their cells briefly before receiving their Christmas meal, which had been prepared according to the enhanced menu that Aldrich Jr. had arranged through negotiations with Martha the jailbaker and Edmund the butcher. Father Benedict collected the wooden crosses from the prisoners, thanked Aldrich Jr. for facilitating the Christmas service, and departed from the jail to return to the monastery, where he would participate in additional Christmas religious observances that were scheduled throughout the day for different segments of the local religious community. As Father Benedict walked up the 12 stone steps and exited the jail, the prisoners remained standing in the corridor for several minutes, not because they were required to remain standing, but because the religious service had created a sense of shared experience that they were reluctant to abandon by immediately returning to the individual isolation of their separate cells. Eventually, Aldrich Jr. indicated that the prisoners should return to their cells to prepare for their Christmas meal, and they complied without resistance, though their compliance seemed more cooperative and less reluctant than usual, suggesting that the religious service had improved their morale temporarily, though temporary morale improvements were common in institutional settings and rarely translated into lasting changes in behavior or attitude. And so concluded the most exciting part of Christmas morning in the Mundanesha jail, a religious service that lasted approximately 25 minutes and represented the closest thing to celebration that the prisoners would experience during their Christmas incarceration. Though calling it a celebration would be generous, since it was more accurately described as a brief interruption in the routine of imprisonment that happened to have religious and seasonal themes. Now that we have established what happened during the religious service, we must examine in exhaustive detail what happened during the Christmas meal that followed, because the Christmas meal represents the second significant deviation from normal jail routine, and understanding the meal requires understanding every aspect of its preparation, service, and consumption, regardless of whether those details contribute meaningfully to anyone's understanding of medieval Christmas experiences. But first, let me explain the exact process by which Martha the jail baker prepared the special Christmas bread, because bread preparation was a complex process that involved multiple steps, each of which must be described in detail to provide complete understanding of why Christmas bread was different from regular bread and why those differences mattered to prisoners who had been eating regular bread for weeks or months. Martha began bread preparation at 4 a.m. on Christmas morning because bread baking required several hours of preparation time and the bread needed to be ready for the prisoners' 11:30 a.m. meal, creating a timeline that required Martha to wake up much earlier than usual and work in her kitchen while most people were still sleeping, including the prisoners who would eventually eat the bread she was preparing. The kitchen where Martha worked was located in her home, which was a 2-room building with a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and general living space, and a smaller room where Martha slept on a straw mattress that she had made herself using straw from local farms and fabric that she had woven from wool that she had purchased from local sheep farmers who raised sheep primarily for wool production rather than meat. The kitchen contained a stone oven that Martha had built with assistance from John the Mason, who was not related to John the Carpenter, but shared the same first name and had professional skills that complemented John the Carpenter's woodworking abilities, creating a local network of craftsmen who could provide construction services for residents who needed buildings or equipment that required specialized knowledge. The oven was heated by burning wood that Martha purchased from forest workers who cut trees under license from Sir Geoffrey, who owned most of the local forest, and charged fees for tree cutting that provided income for forest management and contributed to Sir Geoffrey's overall revenue from natural resource exploitation, which was a significant source of wealth for medieval landowners. The wood used for heating the oven was primarily oak, because oak burned consistently and produced steady heat that was ideal for bread baking, though oak was more expensive than other types of wood and represented a significant cost for Martha's bread-making operation, costs that were reflected in the prices she charged for bread, though jail bread pricing was controlled by Sir Geoffrey rather than determined by market forces. To prepare Christmas bread, Martha began by mixing wheat flour with water, salt, and yeast that she had cultivated from previous bread-making sessions, because commercial yeast was not available in medieval times, and bread makers needed to maintain their own yeast cultures through careful management of fermentation processes that required consistent attention and appropriate environmental conditions. The wheat flour had been ground by Thomas the Miller, using wheat that had been grown by local farmers and purchased by Martha at prices that were higher than barley flour prices, but still within her budget for special occasion bread, though the budget calculations were complicated by the need to balance ingredient costs with the fixed payment she received for providing jail bread throughout the year. The mixing process required Martha to combine ingredients in proportions that she had, learned through years of bread-making experience. Because medieval recipes were not written down in precise measurements, but were passed down through practical training that emphasized developing judgment about proper ratios of ingredients based on visual and tactile assessment of dough consistency and texture. The water used for bread making came from a well that Martha shared with 3 neighboring households because individual household wells were expensive to dig and maintain, and shared wells were a common solution for medieval communities that needed reliable water sources but couldn't afford individual water infrastructure for every family. The well water was generally safe for bread making because the well had been dug deep enough to reach groundwater that was filtered through soil and rock layers that removed most contaminants, though medieval water quality was never guaranteed, and water-related illnesses were common enough that most people preferred to drink ale rather than water whenever possible. The salt used in bread making was purchased from traveling merchants who transported salt from coastal areas where seawater was evaporated to produce salt crystals, because inland areas like Mundaneshire had no local salt sources and depended on trade networks for essential food preservation and flavoring materials that were produced in different geographic regions. Salt was expensive relative to other bread ingredients because transportation costs were high, and salt production required specialized knowledge and equipment that was not available in all locations, making salt a valuable commodity that was carefully measured and conserved in cooking applications. Though bread required salt for both flavor and proper dough development, the yeast culture that Martha maintained was kept in a ceramic container that she had purchased from Robert the Potter, who was not related to any previously mentioned characters, but lived in a neighboring village and produced pottery items that were sold at regional markets where craftsmen could reach customers from multiple communities who needed pottery products that they couldn't make themselves. Maintaining yeast culture required Martha to feed the yeast regularly with flour and water, keep it at appropriate temperature, and monitor its activity to ensure that it remained viable for bread making, because yeast cultures could die if neglected or exposed to extreme temperatures, and replacing dead yeast culture was time-consuming and expensive. The process of mixing bread ingredients required approximately 15 minutes of kneading, during which Martha worked the dough with her hands to develop gluten structure that would allow the bread to rise properly and achieve the texture that distinguished good bread from dense, heavy bread that was difficult to eat and provided less nutritional satisfaction per portion. Kneading bread dough was physically demanding work that required arm and shoulder strength that Martha had developed through years of bread making, though the physical demands of bread making were not considered unusual, because medieval life in general required physical strength and endurance for most daily activities, and people who couldn't perform physical labor had limited options for economic survival. After kneading, the bread dough needed to rise for approximately 2 hours in a warm environment that would encourage yeast activity but not overheat the dough to the point where yeast would die, creating temperature management challenges that Martha addressed by placing the dough near her fireplace and monitoring it regularly to ensure proper fermentation progress. During the rising period, Martha prepared her oven for baking by building a fire inside the oven chamber and allowing the fire to heat the stone walls to the temperature needed for bread baking, a process that required approximately 1 hour and consumed significant quantities of firewood that represented a major expense in Martha's bread-making operation. The oven temperature was measured by Martha's experienced assessment of heat levels, based on visual observation of the oven interior and tactile testing using her hand to sense heat intensity, because medieval baking did not include thermometers or other temperature measurement devices, and bakers relied on experience and intuition to determine when ovens were ready for bread baking. When the oven reached proper temperature, Martha removed the fire and cleaned ash and coal residue from the oven floor, because bread needed to bake in a clean environment that wouldn't contaminate the bread with ash or produce smoky flavors that would make the bread unpalatable, though some smokiness was inevitable and was considered normal in medieval bread. The risen bread dough was shaped into loaves that were sized appropriately for prisoner portions, with each loaf containing enough bread for one prisoner's Christmas meal plus a small additional amount that accounted for the special nature of Christmas portions, which were intended to be slightly more generous than regular meal portions, though not so generous as to create budget problems for jail food operations. Martha shaped 6 loaves for the 6 prisoners, plus 1 additional loaf for her own consumption, because baking small batches of bread was inefficient, and Martha could use the extra bread for her own meals or sell it to local residents who wanted to purchase high-quality bread for their own Christmas celebrations, creating additional income. That helped offset the costs of special ingredient purchases. The shaped loaves were placed in the heated oven using a wooden paddle that Martha had carved herself from a piece of oak board, because specialized bread baking tools were not available for purchase, and bakers needed to make their own equipment using woodworking skills that most medieval people learned as part of general practical education that prepared them for self-sufficient living. The baking process required approximately 45 minutes, during which Martha monitored the bread's progress by observing the color of the crust and listening for sounds that indicated proper baking, because opening the oven door to check bread directly would release heat and interfere with the baking process, making visual and auditory monitoring the preferred techniques for assessing baking progress. While the bread was baking, Martha prepared for the delivery of finished bread to the jail, which required wrapping the loaves in clean cloth to protect them during transportation and keep them warm until they could be served to prisoners, because warm bread was more appealing and easier to eat than cold bread, especially for people whose meal options were limited and who appreciated any enhancement to their dining experience. The cloth used for wrapping bread was linen that Martha had woven herself from flax that she had grown in a small garden behind her house, because producing household textiles was a common domestic activity for medieval women who needed various types of cloth for cooking, cleaning, and other household purposes, but couldn't afford to purchase all textiles from professional weavers. When the bread finished baking, Martha removed it from the oven using her wooden paddle and allowed it to cool for approximately 10 minutes before wrapping it for transport, because bread that was too hot could burn the cloth wrapping or become soggy from steam condensation, while bread that was too cool would lose the appeal of fresh-baked warmth that made Christmas bread special, compared to day-old bread that was normally served to prisoners. The transportation of bread from Martha's kitchen to the jail required a walk of approximately 8 minutes through streets that were muddy from recent rain, but not impassably muddy, creating walking conditions that were typical for medieval winter weather and required careful attention to foot placement to avoid slipping or stepping in deep puddles that could soak through leather shoes and make feet cold and uncomfortable. Martha carried the wrapped bread in a wooden basket that she had purchased from William the basket maker, who was not related to William the debtor, but shared the same first name and had specialized skills in weaving baskets from willow branches that grew in swampy areas near the town, areas that were otherwise unsuitable for agriculture, but produced useful materials for basket making and other crafts. The basket was large enough to hold all 7 loaves of bread, plus additional space for the meat portions that Edmund the butcher would provide, creating an efficient delivery system that would allow Martha to transport the complete Christmas meal in a single trip, rather than making multiple trips between the jail and different food suppliers. Martha's first stop was Edmund the butcher's shop, where she collected the 6 portions of salted beef that Edmund had prepared according to his agreement with Aldrich Jr., portions that had been boiled in salted water with herbs that Edmund grew in his own garden for flavoring meat products, that he sold to customers who could afford enhanced flavor in their meat purchases. The herbs used for flavoring the beef included thyme, rosemary, and sage that Edmund had dried during the summer and stored in clay containers that preserved the herbs' flavor and prevented spoilage during winter months when fresh herbs were not available, because medieval food preservation required careful planning and preparation during harvest seasons to ensure adequate supplies of flavoring and preservation materials throughout the year. The boiled beef portions were wrapped in clean cloth, similar to the cloth Martha used for bread, creating a coordinated presentation that demonstrated the special attention that had been devoted to preparing Christmas meals that were superior to regular jail food in both ingredients and preparation methods. though the improvements were modest by modern standards and represented the maximum enhancement that medieval jail budgets could support. Edmund the butcher charged Martha the agreed-upon price of 8 pence for the 6 beef portions, payment that Martha provided using coins that she had received from Sir Geoffrey's clerk as advance payment for Christmas food preparation, because special meal expenses required advance funding that ensured food suppliers could purchase necessary ingredients without risking their own financial resources on jail food improvements. With both bread and meat loaded in her basket, Martha walked from Edmund's shop to the jail, arriving at approximately 11:25 a.m., which was 5 minutes earlier than the scheduled mealtime, but close enough to the schedule to demonstrate that medieval timing, while imprecise by modern standards, was adequate for coordinating simple activities like delivering prison meals. Aldrich Jr. was waiting for Martha's arrival and helped her carry the food basket down the 12 stone steps to the jail corridor, where the prisoners were already assembled in their cells, but could smell the aroma of fresh bread and cooked meat. Smells that created anticipation and improved mood among people whose sensory experiences had been limited to the basic smells of stone, straw, and simple gruel for weeks or months. The distribution of Christmas meals required Aldrich Jr. to unlock each cell individually and hand food portions directly to prisoners, because allowing prisoners to leave their cells simultaneously for meal distribution would create security concerns and crowd management challenges that were unnecessary when food could be delivered directly to individual cells without compromising safety or order. William the debtor was served first, receiving 1 loaf of wheat bread and 1 portion of boiled beef that was still warm from recent preparation, food that represented a significant improvement over his usual diet and created genuine appreciation that was expressed through thanks to Aldrich Jr. and comments about the superior quality and quantity of Christmas food compared to regular jail meals. Margaret the thief was served second, receiving identical food portions and expressing similar appreciation, though her thanks were more enthusiastic because she had been concerned that her criminal conviction might result in reduced Christmas privileges, and receiving the same meal as other prisoners indicated that Christmas food improvements were applied equally, regardless of crime type or sentence length. Robert the Unlucky was served third, receiving his food portions with quiet gratitude that reflected his general resignation to his legal situation, combined with genuine appreciation for any positive experiences that could be found within the constraints of imprisonment. Though he remained concerned that his Christmas meal might be his last Christmas meal if his legal problems were not resolved favorably. Peter the Drunk was served fourth, receiving his Christmas meal with obvious relief and gratitude because he had been worried that his defamatory comments about Sir Geoffrey might result in punishment that would include exclusion from Christmas food improvements, and receiving standard Christmas portions indicated that his legal problems had not escalated to the point of additional punishment beyond continued imprisonment. Agnes the Vagrant was served fifth, receiving her Christmas meal with emotional gratitude that was more intense than other prisoners' reactions, because her life experiences had included periods of genuine hunger and food insecurity that made any meal improvement especially meaningful. And Christmas meal enhancements represented luxury that exceeded her expectations for jail food quality. Harold the Confused was served last, receiving his Christmas meal with bewildered appreciation that was consistent with his general confusion about his circumstances, though he clearly understood that the food was special and better than usual, and he expressed thanks in ways that suggested his confusion did not extend to basic social courtesy and appreciation for kindness from others. Each prisoner received their Christmas meal in wooden bowls that were used specifically for special occasions, bowls that were cleaner and in better condition than the bowls normally used for jail meals, because Sir Geoffrey had authorized the use of better serving equipment for Christmas as part of the overall enhancement of prison Christmas observances. The wooden bowls had been carved by Thomas the Wood Carver, who was not related to any previously mentioned Thomases, but shared the common first name and had specialized skills in creating wooden household items that were sold to local residents who needed bowls, spoons, and other eating utensils that were essential for daily life but required woodworking expertise to produce. Along with the improved bowls, each prisoner received a wooden spoon that was also in better condition than usual jail eating utensils, creating a coordinated upgrade in both food quality and serving equipment that demonstrated comprehensive attention to Christmas meal improvement rather than partial improvements that might have seemed arbitrary or inadequate. The consumption of Christmas meals by the 6 prisoners occurred simultaneously, but individually, with each prisoner eating in their own cell at their own pace, though the improved food quality meant that all prisoners ate more slowly than usual, apparently savoring flavors and textures that were superior to their normal diet, and represented a temporary return to food quality that resembled what they might have eaten before their imprisonment. William the debtor ate his Christmas meal, methodically, taking small bites and chewing thoroughly, behavior that suggested he was consciously trying to make the meal last as long as possible because he understood that it represented a temporary improvement that would end with the completion of the meal and return to regular jail food the following day. Margaret the thief ate her meal quickly at first, apparently motivated by hunger and enthusiasm for improved food, but then slowed her eating pace when she realized that finishing quickly would end the pleasant experience sooner, demonstrating adaptive behavior that maximized the psychological benefits of the Christmas meal enhancement. Robert the Unlucky ate his meal with quiet concentration, focusing attention on the food in ways that suggested he was using the meal as a form of meditation or mental distraction from concerns about his legal situation, because food-focused attention could provide temporary relief from anxiety about uncertain future outcomes. Peter the Drunk ate his meal with obvious pleasure, commenting quietly to himself about the superior flavor and texture of Christmas food compared to regular jail food, behavior that demonstrated his recovery from alcohol-related impairment and return to normal appreciation for sensory experiences that had been dulled during his period of excessive drinking. Agnes the Vagrant ate her meal with careful attention to consuming every portion completely, behavior that reflected her experience with food scarcity and her understanding that wasting food was economically and morally inappropriate, especially food that represented special generosity from people who had no obligation to provide food. Improvements for prisoners. Harold the Confused ate his meal with the same bewildered appreciation that characterized his other activities, though his eating behavior was normal and suggested that whatever confusion affected his memory and orientation did not extend to basic physical functions like eating, digestion, and appreciation for food quality improvements. The Christmas meals were completed by all prisoners within approximately 30 minutes, which was longer than usual meal consumption time and reflected both the larger quantity of food and the prisoners' desire to extend the eating experience as long as possible, because they understood that Christmas meal improvements were temporary and would be followed by return to regular jail food for the remainder of their imprisonment. After finishing their meals, prisoners returned their wooden bowls and spoons to Aldrich Jr., who collected the eating utensils for cleaning and storage until the next special occasion that might warrant their use, though such occasions were rare and most prisoners would not experience similar meal improvements again during their current incarceration period. The cleanup process required Martha to wash the special bowls and spoons using hot water and soap that she had made from animal fat and wood ash, because maintaining clean eating utensils was important for preventing disease transmission and ensuring that special serving equipment remained in good condition for future use during other special occasions. Martha also collected the cloth wrappings that had been used for transporting bread and meat, cloth that would need to be washed and dried before being used again for food transport or other household purposes, because medieval textile resources were valuable and needed to be maintained through proper care and cleaning to ensure maximum useful life. The financial cost of the Christmas meal improvements totaled approximately 1 shilling and 3 pence, which included Martha's labor for bread preparation, Edmund's charges for meat portions, and additional costs for special ingredients like wheat flour and herbs, representing a significant expense that was approximately equal to 3 days of normal jail food costs for all 6 prisoners. This expense was justified by Sir Geoffrey as appropriate Christmas celebration for prisoners who were members of the local community despite their current legal problems. and who deserved recognition of their human dignity through modest improvements in their living conditions during the most important religious celebration of the year. However, the expense also meant that jail food costs for January would need to be reduced to maintain the annual jail budget, creating a system where Christmas meal improvements would be partially offset by meal reductions during subsequent weeks, though prisoners were not informed of this budget balancing because it might have reduced their appreciation for Christmas generosity. The Christmas meal represented the culmination of Christmas Day activities in the jail because no additional special activities had been planned or budgeted, and prisoners would return to regular jail routine for the remainder of December 25th and subsequent days, though the psychological impact of Christmas improvements would continue to influence prisoner morale for several days or weeks after the actual Christmas celebration. The empty food basket was returned to Martha's kitchen, where it would be cleaned and stored until needed for future food transport activities, because basket maintenance was important for ensuring reliable food delivery capabilities and protecting the investment that Martha had made in purchasing quality basket work from local craftsmen, and so concluded the Christmas meal portion of Christmas Day in the Mundaneshire jail, a meal that had required extensive planning, coordination, and expense to provide modest improvements in food quality and serving equipment that demonstrated community recognition of prisoners' humanity while maintaining appropriate distinctions between free citizens and people who were serving sentences for criminal activities. If you're still here, and honestly I'm impressed that you are, this might be a good time to remind you about that boring Christmas calendar featuring Sleepy Knoll. By now you've experienced approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes of the most methodical, detailed, and deliberately tedious Christmas content ever created, which means you have a deep appreciation for the art of transforming simple concepts into exhaustively comprehensive experiences. The boring Christmas calendar operates on the same principle. Instead of exciting Advent activities or engaging holiday countdown experiences, it offers 31 days of Sleepy Knoll expressing mild variations of drowsiness and seasonal contentment. Day 12 features Sleepy Knoll looking slightly more tired than Day 11. Day 23 features Sleepy Knoll looking exactly as tired as you probably feel right now. This calendar is perfect for people who have watched over an hour of content about medieval Christmas in jail and somehow found it engaging enough to continue watching. It's designed for individuals who appreciate the subtle art of taking simple concepts and exploring them with the kind of thoroughness that most people would consider excessive, but you clearly recognize as appropriately comprehensive. The calendar is available through the link pinned in the comments, where you can purchase it for a limited time, though limited time in this context means it will eventually disappear, much like your enthusiasm for most things, but not like your apparent enthusiasm for extremely detailed content about historically insignificant topics. If you purchase this calendar, you'll own a unique piece of boring Christmas merchandise that demonstrates your commitment to the aesthetic of deliberate tedium mixed with seasonal themes. You'll also be supporting the creation of additional boring content, which means more opportunities to experience the peculiar satisfaction of learning far more than necessary about topics that most people would never think to investigate in detail. Now back to our medieval Christmas jail story, which still has approximately 8 minutes remaining because we committed to 2 hours of content and we're going to deliver exactly 2 hours of content. Regardless of whether the remaining material adds anything meaningful to your understanding of Christmas in medieval imprisonment. At this point in our exhaustive examination of Christmas Day in the Mundaneshire Jail 1247, we must pause to consider the profound meaninglessness of everything we have just explored in excruciating detail. You have now spent nearly 2 hours learning about 6 prisoners whose names you will forget, whose crimes were minor, and whose Christmas experiences were only marginally different from their non-Christmas experiences. This raises philosophical questions about why anyone would invest 2 hours in learning about something so thoroughly unremarkable. Medieval Christmas in jail was not a turning point in history. It did not influence the development of Christmas traditions. It had no lasting impact on criminal justice systems. It contributed nothing to human knowledge or cultural advancement. Yet here you are, nearly at the end of this comprehensive exploration, having absorbed thousands of words about bread preparation, meat distribution, wooden crosses, and the precise dimensions of jail cells that no longer exist in a town whose modern location is occupied by a Starbucks parking lot. The 6 prisoners whose Christmas we have documented in exhaustive detail lived ordinary lives, committed ordinary crimes, served ordinary sentences, and were eventually released to resume lives that were just as ordinary as their crimes and their imprisonments. William paid his debt, Margaret learned to steal more carefully, Robert was eventually cleared of robbery charges, Peter reduced his alcohol consumption, Agnes found temporary housing, and Harold's confusion gradually resolved, though whether this resolution was due to medical recovery or simply adaptation to his circumstances remains unclear from historical records that don't exist, because no one bothered to document the subsequent lives of minor criminals from insignificant medieval towns. Their Christmas Day religious service was forgotten immediately after it ended. Their Christmas meal was digested and eliminated according to normal biological processes. Their temporary improvement in morale faded within days as they returned to the routine of medieval imprisonment, which continued to be exactly as boring and uncomfortable as it had been before Christmas, and as it would be after Christmas. Father Benedict conducted hundreds of similar religious services throughout his career as a priest, and the Christmas jail service represented such a minor part of his religious duties that he probably didn't remember it clearly by the following Easter. Martha baked thousands of loaves of bread during her career as a baker, and the Christmas jail bread represented such a small portion of her professional output that she probably reused the same techniques for other special occasions without thinking specifically about the prisoner application. Edmund the Butcher prepared countless portions of meat during his career, and the Christmas jail meat represented such a routine transaction that he probably handled similar orders from other customers throughout the year without considering the Christmas jail portions to be particularly significant or memorable compared to his regular commercial activities. Sir Geoffrey made thousands of administrative decisions during his time as local magistrate, and his authorization for Christmas jail improvements represented such a minor expense and such a routine application of seasonal customs that he probably signed the authorization without giving it particular thought or consideration beyond ensuring that costs remained within acceptable budget parameters. Even Aldrich Jr., who had the most direct involvement in Christmas jail activities, probably considered Christmas 1247 to be a normal variation on his regular duties, rather than a special occasion worth remembering or discussing with family members or friends, because medieval life was characterized by routine activities that were occasionally modified by seasonal customs, but rarely involved experiences that people would consider noteworthy or conversation-worthy. The stone corridor where the religious service took place was demolished sometime in the 14th century, when the jail was moved to a different building, and the stones were probably reused for other construction projects where they served equally mundane functions in equally forgettable buildings that were also eventually demolished and replaced by other equally temporary structures. The wooden crosses that Brother Marcus carved for the Christmas service were probably used for other religious occasions and eventually wore out or broke and were replaced by identical crosses carved by Brother Marcus or his successors, because wooden crosses were consumable religious supplies rather than permanent artifacts worth preserving for historical documentation or sentimental reasons. The bowls and spoons used for the Christmas meal were probably used for other special occasions until they wore out or broke and were replaced by identical bowls and spoons carved by the same craftsman or his successors, because wooden eating utensils were functional tools rather than commemorative objects that anyone would preserve specifically because of their association with Christmas jail meals. The cloth used for wrapping Christmas bread and meat was probably washed and reused for hundreds of other food transport activities until it wore out and was replaced by identical cloth woven by Martha or other local textile producers, because medieval cloth was valuable for its utility rather than its historical associations with specific meals or occasions. Even the jail building itself, which housed this comprehensive Christmas celebration, was eventually replaced by other buildings that served other purposes for other people who had no knowledge of or interest in the fact that medieval prisoners had once eaten slightly better bread and small portions of meat in rooms that no longer existed in a building that had been forgotten by everyone who might have remembered it. This means that the 2 hours you have invested in learning about Christmas in medieval jail represents 2 hours of attention devoted to events that left no trace in historical records, influenced no subsequent developments, and mattered to no one beyond the immediate participants, all of whom died centuries ago and were buried in graves that are now unmarked and whose locations are unknown to anyone currently living. The comprehensive detail with which we have explored these irrelevant historical events serves no practical purpose, contributes nothing to modern understanding of Christmas traditions or medieval life, and provides no useful information that could be applied to contemporary problems or opportunities. Yet you have remained engaged throughout this exploration, suggesting that the human mind finds some form of satisfaction in comprehensive examination of thoroughly unimportant topics, possibly because comprehensive examination creates an illusion of understanding or mastery that is psychologically rewarding regardless of whether the subject matter has any objective significance or aren't exciting expressions. They're not dynamic expressions. They're exactly the kind of mild, unremarkable expressions you'd expect from someone named Sleepy Noel. Day 1 features Sleepy Noel looking slightly tired. Day 2 features Sleepy Noel looking slightly more tired. Day 31 features Sleepy Noel looking exactly as tired as you'll feel after watching this entire video. This calendar is available for a limited time, which means it will disappear eventually, much like your enthusiasm for Christmas after experiencing it through the lens of medieval imprisonment. You can find the link pinned in the comments below. Buying this calendar won't make your Christmas more exciting, but it will give you something to look at while you contemplate the passage of time in the same way medieval prisoners contemplated the passage of time, slowly, methodically, and with growing acceptance of the inevitable. If you purchase this calendar, you'll join the exclusive group of people who bought a boring Christmas calendar from someone making videos about medieval jail Christmas celebrations. This group currently consists of 0 people, but you could be the first, or not. The choice is yours, and like most choices, it ultimately doesn't matter much. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming about the administrative details of medieval Christmas in jail, which somehow manages to be even less exciting than a calendar, featuring a character named Sleepy Noel. Now, where were we? Ah yes, the 6 cells. Let me describe each one in the kind of detail typically reserved for police reports or insurance claims. The first cell contained William the debtor. William owed 3 shillings to Thomas the baker for bread he'd consumed in September. The bread was made from barley flour, which had been ground at the mill owned by Sir Geoffrey, who charged a fee for grinding grain, because that's how mills worked in 1247. But first, let me explain the medieval monetary system, because understanding currency is essential to understanding debt, and understanding debt is essential to understanding why William was in jail, though understanding why William was in jail has nothing to do with understanding Christmas in jail, but we're committed to thoroughness over relevance. A shilling in 1247 was worth 12 pence, a penny was worth 1 penny. This seems straightforward, until you realize that medieval currency values fluctuated based on the availability of silver, the trustworthiness of the person who minted the coins, and various other factors that medieval economists probably understood, but didn't bother explaining to anyone else. William's debt of 3 shillings represented approximately 36 days of wages for an unskilled laborer, assuming the laborer could find work every day, which was unlikely, especially in winter, which was most of the year in medieval England, due to climate patterns we won't explore, because climate is complex, and complexity is the enemy of proper boredom. The bread that created William's debt was made using a recipe that had been passed down through Thomas the baker's family for 3 generations. The recipe called for barley flour, water, and salt, sometimes yeast if available. Medieval bread was not known for its variety or its flavor, much like medieval jail food, which we'll discuss at length later, because discussing jail food at Length is exactly the kind of content commitment this video demands. Thomas the Baker had learned the bread-making trade from his father, Thomas the Baker Sr., who had learned it from his father, Thomas the Baker I. The Baker family. Naming convention was as creative as their bread recipes, which is to say, not creative at all. The bakery where Thomas worked was located on Baker Street, a name that seems almost suspiciously appropriate until you realize that medieval streets were named with the same imaginative flair as medieval baking recipes. There was also a Miller Street, a Smith Street, and a Street Street, which was just called Street, because the person responsible for naming streets had apparently run out of ideas after naming the first 3 streets. Thomas the Baker's oven was made of clay and stones, heated by burning wood that was cut from trees in the nearby forest. The forest was owned by Sir Geoffrey, the same Sir Geoffrey who owned the grain mill, because Sir Geoffrey had cornered the market on essential services in Mundaneshire through what modern economists would call vertical integration and what medieval people called Sir Geoffrey owns everything. The wood used to heat the oven came from oak trees that were approximately 37 years old when they were cut down. I mention their age because tree age is the kind of specific detail that contributes nothing to the story, but demonstrates the thoroughness that separates truly boring content from merely sleep-inducing content. But let's return to William the Debtor, who was sitting in the first cell on Christmas morning 1247, contemplating his debt to Thomas the Baker, and presumably wondering why he hadn't simply eaten less bread in September. Though wondering about past decisions is a luxury that medieval debtors rarely had time for, given that most of their time was spent being in jail for debt. William was 28 years old, had brown hair like most people in 1247, and brown eyes like most people in 1247, because genetic diversity in small medieval towns was limited by transportation technology and social customs that discouraged extensive travel for the purpose of meeting people with different eye colors. He had been in jail for 43 days when Christmas arrived, which meant he had been arrested on November 12th, a date I calculated by counting backwards from December 25th, which required mathematics that medieval people would have found impressive if they had access to modern calendars and counting systems, which they didn't. During his 43 days in jail, William had eaten approximately 129 meals, assuming 3 meals per day, though medieval jail meals were more like food-adjacent experiences than actual meals. Each meal consisted of bread, not from Thomas the Baker, thin gruel made from oats, and water that had been boiled to remove some, but not all, of the things that made medieval water dangerous to drink. The bread served in jail was made by Martha, the jail baker, who was not related to Thomas the Baker, but had learned bread making from someone who had once met someone who had worked for someone who was distantly related to someone who might have known Thomas the Baker's great-uncle. Medieval professional. Networks were small and confusingly interconnected. Martha's jail bread was made from inferior flour, less salt, and a general attitude of resignation that permeated all aspects of medieval jail food preparation. The bread was edible in the sense that it could be eaten, but not in the sense that anyone particularly wanted to eat it. The gruel was made from oats that had been rejected by the local livestock, which says something about the quality of the oats, though what it says exactly is unclear, because medieval livestock had different standards than modern livestock, and we don't have access to medieval animal food preference surveys. Now let me tell you about the second cell, which contained Margaret the thief. Margaret had stolen a chicken from Farmer Edmund, who owned 7 chickens, making the theft of 1 chicken approximately 14.3% of his poultry assets, a percentage. That seems significant until you realize that medieval chickens were not particularly valuable, unless you needed eggs or chicken meat, which most people did, which is why stealing chickens was illegal. But first, let me explain medieval farming techniques, because understanding how chickens were raised helps explain why stealing chickens was considered a serious crime, though explaining why chicken theft was serious has minimal relevance to Christmas in jail. But thoroughness demands that we explore every tangentially related topic we encounter. Medieval chickens were smaller than modern chickens, ate whatever they could find rather than specially formulated chicken feed, and lived shorter lives due to diseases that modern veterinary medicine has eliminated. They were, by all accounts, not particularly impressive chickens, but they were the only chickens available in 1247, so people accepted them much like they accepted everything else about medieval life, with resignation and low expectations. Farmer. Edmund's 7 chickens lived in a wooden structure that he had built himself using carpentry skills he'd learned from his neighbor, who had learned carpentry from someone else, because medieval skill acquisition was based on informal apprenticeships and the hope that someone nearby knew what they were doing. The chicken coop was approximately 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet high, dimensions that provided adequate space for 7 chickens according to medieval animal husbandry standards, which were notably less concerned with animal welfare than modern standards. Though medieval people weren't intentionally cruel to animals, they just had limited resources and more pressing concerns like not dying from various diseases that killed medieval people on a regular basis. The stolen chicken was named Brunhilde, a name that seems overly dramatic for a medieval chicken, until you realize that medieval people named their farm animals with the same creativity they used for naming their children, their streets, and their bread recipes. Brunhilde was 3 years old, which was middle-aged for a medieval chicken, and had laid approximately 200 eggs during her lifetime, making her a productive member of Farmer Edmund's agricultural operation. Margaret stole Brunhilde on October 31st, a date that would later become associated with Halloween, but in 1247 was just another day in the medieval calendar, which had 365 days like modern calendars, but felt longer because medieval people had fewer ways to distract themselves from the passage of time. The theft occurred at approximately midday, when Farmer Edmund was working in his barley field, which was located far enough from the chicken coop that he couldn't see or hear what was happening to his poultry assets. This was poor farm security by modern standards, but medieval farmers had limited options for securing their property, beyond hoping that their neighbors weren't thieves. Margaret approached the chicken coop with a plan that she had developed over several days of observation. The plan involved opening the coop door, grabbing a chicken, and leaving quickly. This was not a complex plan, but complex plans were difficult to execute in 1247 due to limited resources and the general unpredictability of medieval life. She successfully captured Brunhilde, who struggled briefly but was ultimately overpowered. Because humans are larger and stronger than chickens, a biological advantage that has remained constant throughout history, Margaret then carried Brunhilde away from Farmer Edmund's property, walking quickly, but not running because running would have attracted attention, and attracting attention was the opposite of Margaret's goal. Unfortunately for Margaret, she was seen by Thomas the shepherd, who was not related to Thomas the baker, but shared the same first name because medieval naming conventions were limited. Thomas the shepherd was watching his sheep in a field adjacent to Farmer Edmund's property and had a clear view of the chicken theft. Now we should discuss medieval legal procedures, because understanding how chicken theft was prosecuted helps explain how Margaret ended up in jail, though explaining legal procedures has nothing to do with Christmas celebrations, but we're committed to providing context for every aspect of this story, regardless of relevance. Medieval justice was administered through a system of local courts presided over by magistrates who were appointed based on their social standing rather than their legal knowledge. The magistrate in Mundaneshire was Sir Geoffrey, the same Sir Geoffrey who owned the grain mill and the forest, because Sir Geoffrey had accumulated most of the important positions in town through what medieval people called being wealthy and what modern people would call monopolistic concentration of power. Thomas the shepherd reported the chicken theft to Aldrich Jr., who was responsible for law enforcement, in addition to jail management, because medieval job descriptions were broader and less specialized than modern job descriptions. Aldrich investigated the crime by asking people if they had seen Margaret with a chicken, which was considered sophisticated detective work in 1247. Several witnesses confirmed that they had seen Margaret carrying a chicken that matched Brunhilde's description, which was brown chicken of average size, a description that applied to most chickens in 1247, but was considered sufficient evidence because medieval legal standards were more relaxed than modern legal standards. Margaret was arrested on November 15th and brought before Sir Geoffrey for trial. The trial lasted approximately 30 minutes and consisted of Sir Geoffrey asking Margaret if she had stolen the chicken, Margaret saying no, Thomas the shepherd and 3 other witnesses saying yes, and Sir Geoffrey deciding that Margaret was guilty based on witness testimony and the fact that she couldn't produce the chicken she claimed she didn't steal. The sentence was imprisonment until Margaret could pay restitution to Farmer Edmund for the value of 1 chicken, plus court costs, plus jail fees, plus various other fees that Sir Geoffrey imposed because medieval justice was partially funded through fines and fees collected from people who couldn't afford to pay fines and fees. The total amount Margaret owed was 1 shilling and 8 pence, which represented approximately 20 days of wages for an unskilled female labourer. Assuming such work was available, which it rarely was, especially for women who had been convicted of chicken theft and were therefore considered unreliable. Margaret had been in jail for 40 days when Christmas arrived, during which time she had not been able to earn the money needed to pay her debt, because earning money while in jail was not possible in 1247, creating a system where people arrested for poverty-related crimes became increasingly unable to escape poverty, though this systemic problem was not recognized as a systemic problem, because medieval economic theory was less developed than medieval chicken-raising techniques. Now, let me tell you about the 3rd cell, which contained Robert the Unlucky. Robert had not committed a crime in the traditional sense, but had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, while carrying a knife that looked similar to a knife that had been used in a robbery that had occurred 3 weeks earlier in a town 15 miles away. But first, let me explain medieval knife ownership, because understanding why Robert had a knife helps explain why having a knife could be considered suspicious, though explaining knife ownership has nothing to do with Christmas celebrations, but we've established a pattern of explaining everything whether or not it's relevant, and breaking patterns would be inconsistent with our commitment to thoroughness. In medieval England, most adult men carried knives for practical purposes. Knives were tools used for eating, cutting rope, woodworking, food preparation, and various other daily tasks that required cutting things. Not carrying a knife was more unusual than carrying one, which makes Robert's situation particularly absurd, though absurdity was common in medieval legal situations due to the combination of unclear laws and limited investigation techniques. Robert's knife had a wooden handle carved from beechwood and an iron blade that was approximately 4 inches long. The blade had been forged by Alan the blacksmith, who was not related to any of the previously mentioned characters, but lived in the same general area because medieval communities were small and everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew someone who knew everyone else. Alan the blacksmith had made the knife 3 years earlier as part of a batch of 12 similar knives that he had sold to various local residents. This means there were 11 other knives that looked exactly like Robert's knife, a fact that would have been relevant to Robert's legal situation if medieval investigations had been thorough enough to discover and consider such facts. The robbery that created Robert's legal problems had occurred in the town of Dullingham, which was named either after a person called Duller or because the town was particularly dull, though historical records don't specify which etymology is correct, and both explanations seem equally plausible, given what we know about medieval naming conventions and the general excitement level of medieval life. The robbery victim was a travelling merchant named Geoffrey the Merchant, who was not related to Sir Geoffrey, but shared the same first name because Geoffrey was a popular name in medieval England, possibly because medieval parents had limited name options or because they genuinely liked the name Geoffrey, though we have no records of medieval name preference surveys to confirm either hypothesis. Geoffrey the Merchant had been travelling from London to Norwich with a cart containing various goods including wool, salt, iron tools, and 3 live pigs that were intended for sale at the Norwich market. The total value of his merchandise was approximately £2 sterling, which represented significant wealth in 1247, though the wealth was portable and therefore vulnerable to robbery, which is why Geoffrey the Merchant had been robbed rather than someone with less portable wealth like land or buildings. The robbery occurred on a road between Dullingham and Norwich at approximately sunset, when visibility was poor due to natural lighting conditions and the absence of artificial lighting, which hadn't been invented yet. The robber approached Geoffrey's cart, threatened him with a knife, and demanded that Geoffrey surrender his merchandise. Geoffrey later described the robber as a man of average height, with brown hair and brown eyes, carrying a knife with a wooden handle, which was a description that applied to approximately half the adult male population of medieval England. The knife detail was the most specific part of the description because most people could distinguish between wooden knife handles and bone knife handles, though distinguishing between different types of wood was beyond most people's expertise. Geoffrey reported the robbery to the local constable in Norwich, who sent word to constables in surrounding towns to watch for suspicious individuals matching Geoffrey's description, which resulted in several dozen arrests of men who had the misfortune of being of average height, with brown hair and brown eyes, while carrying knives with wooden handles. Robert was arrested in Mundaneshire while walking to the market to buy salt, which he needed for preserving meat for winter storage. His presence in the market area while carrying a knife was interpreted as suspicious by Aldrich Jr., who had received the notification about the robbery and was eager to demonstrate his law enforcement capabilities. The arrest occurred on December 5th, 20 days before Christmas, when Robert was questioned about his whereabouts on the day of the robbery. Robert explained that he had been working in his garden, harvesting turnips that would be stored for winter consumption, but had no witnesses to corroborate his story because turnip harvesting was typically done alone, and Robert lived by himself, in a cottage that was far enough from his neighbors that they wouldn't have seen him working in his garden. Robert's inability to prove his innocence was interpreted as evidence of guilt, because medieval legal theory held that innocent people should be able to provide witnesses to their activities, even though most daily activities in medieval life were performed without witnesses because medieval people were too busy surviving to spend time observing each other's turnip harvesting activities. Robert was brought before Sir Geoffrey for trial, where he explained that his knife had been purchased from Alan the blacksmith 3 years earlier and had never been used for anything more threatening than cutting bread and trimming leather. Sir Geoffrey noted that Robert's story was plausible but unprovable, and that plausible but unprovable stories were indistinguishable from lies designed to avoid punishment for robbery. The trial concluded with Sir Geoffrey deciding that Robert should remain in jail until the robbery investigation was complete, which meant Robert would be imprisoned indefinitely because medieval investigations were not known for their speed or efficiency, especially investigations involving crimes that had occurred in other towns with limited communication and coordination between law enforcement authorities. Robert had been in jail for 20 days when Christmas arrived, during which time no progress had been made in the robbery investigation, because investigating crimes in 1247 required traveling to other towns to interview witnesses, and winter travel was difficult and expensive, and Sir Geoffrey had other responsibilities that took priority over investigating robberies that had happened to merchants from other towns. Now let me describe the other cell, which contained Peter the drunk. Peter had been arrested for public intoxication, though public intoxication in medieval times was more of a social concern than a legal one, because most social gatherings involved alcohol consumption, and most alcohol consumption resulted in some degree of intoxication, making public intoxication a common occurrence that was usually ignored unless it resulted in disruptive behavior. Peter's arrest was the result of disruptive behavior that had occurred during the Feast of St. Andrew on November 30th, when Peter had consumed an excessive amount of ale and began singing loudly in the town square at approximately midnight, disturbing the sleep of nearby residents who needed to wake early for agricultural work that couldn't be postponed due to livestock feeding schedules and other time-sensitive farming activities. But first, let me explain medieval alcohol consumption, because understanding why Peter was drunk helps explain why being drunk was considered problematic. Though explaining medieval drinking habits has nothing to do with Christmas in jail, but we've committed to explaining every aspect of every character's situation, regardless of relevance to the main topic. Ale was the primary alcoholic beverage in medieval England because wine was expensive and imported, and distilled spirits hadn't been invented yet. leaving ale as the most practical option for people who wanted to drink alcohol, which was most people, because medieval water was often unsafe to drink due to contamination from various sources that we won't detail because explaining medieval sanitation would require another lengthy tangent that would distract us from our current lengthy tangent. About medieval ale consumption. Medieval ale was brewed from barley, hops, and water, using yeast that occurred naturally in the environment rather than cultivated yeast strains that are used in modern brewing. This resulted in ale that was less predictable in terms of alcohol content and flavor than modern beer, though medieval drinkers had adjusted expectations because unpredictable ale was the only ale available. The alcohol content of medieval ale varied between 2% and 8%, depending on the brewing technique, the quality of ingredients, and various environmental factors that affected fermentation. Most ale was relatively weak by modern standards, which meant that achieving significant intoxication required consuming large quantities, which Peter had done on the night of November 30th. Peter had begun drinking at approximately 6 p.m. at the Esau tavern owned by Hugh the Tavern Keeper, who was not related to any previously mentioned characters, but lived in the same town because medieval communities were small and contained limited numbers of tavern keepers, usually one, which was Hugh. The tavern was located on Tavern Street, which was named with the same creative flair as Baker Street and Miller Street. The building had 2 rooms, a main room where customers consumed ale, and a back room where Hugh stored barrels of ale and slept, because medieval tavern keepers typically lived at their place of business due to security concerns and the general medieval practice of living where you worked. Peter arrived at the tavern with 2 friends, Edmund the farm worker and Thomas the other Thomas, who were not related to any of the previously mentioned Edmunds or Thomases, but shared those names because medieval name diversity was limited. The 3 men had planned to celebrate the feast of St. Andrew by consuming ale and discussing topics that medieval men typically discussed while consuming ale, such as weather, crop yields, and the general difficulty of medieval life. The celebration began normally, with Peter and his friends consuming ale at a moderate pace, while engaging in conversations about topics that were important to them but would be considered incredibly boring by modern standards. They discussed the quality of this year's barley harvest, the likelihood of a harsh winter, and the recent increase in the price of salt, which affected everyone because salt was essential for food preservation. However, as the evening progressed, Peter consumed more ale than his friends, partly because he was celebrating his birthday, which was also November 30th, making the Feast of St. Andrew doubly significant for Peter, though celebrating birthdays was not a widespread medieval custom, and most people didn't know their exact birth dates anyway. By 10 p.m., Peter had consumed approximately 1 gallon of ale, which represents a significant amount of alcohol, even considering the relatively low alcohol content of medieval ale. His friends attempted to persuade him to stop drinking and return home, but Peter insisted on continuing the celebration because birthdays that coincided with religious feast days were rare occurrences that deserved special recognition. Edmund the farm worker and Thomas the other Thomas eventually left the tavern without Peter because they needed to wake early for farm work and couldn't afford to lose sleep due to Peter's extended celebration. This left Peter alone at the tavern with Hugh the tavern keeper, who continued serving ale to Peter because medieval tavern keepers were not responsible for monitoring their customers' alcohol consumption, and refusing to serve paying customers would have been bad business. Peter remained at the tavern until approximately 11:30 p.m. when Hugh closed the establishment and asked Peter to leave. Peter complied but was unsteady on his feet due to alcohol consumption and decided to sit in the town square to rest before attempting to walk home, which was a reasonable decision from a safety perspective, but ultimately led to his legal problems. While sitting in the town square, Peter began singing songs that he remembered from his childhood, though his memory was impaired by alcohol consumption, so the songs were incomplete and largely incoherent. The singing was loud enough to wake several nearby residents, including Martha the seamstress, who lived above her shop adjacent to the town square. Martha opened her window and asked Peter to sing more quietly, but Peter, emboldened by alcohol, and birthday excitement, increased his singing volume and began singing additional songs that he remembered even less clearly than the first songs. This prompted Martha to wake her neighbor, John the carpenter, who was not related to any previously mentioned characters, but lived nearby because medieval towns were small and everyone lived close to everyone else. John the carpenter also asked Peter to sing more quietly, but Peter responded by standing up and singing even louder while attempting to dance, though his dancing was impaired by alcohol consumption and consisted mainly of swaying and occasional stumbling. This attracted the attention of additional neighbors who gathered at their windows to observe Peter's performance. The gathering crowd encouraged Peter, who interpreted their attention as appreciation for his singing and dancing, though the crowd was actually discussing how to stop the noise so they could return to sleep. This misunderstanding is typical of alcohol-impaired judgment, where intoxicated individuals misinterpret social cues and believe they are more entertaining than they actually are. The situation escalated when Peter climbed onto the stone platform in the center of the town square, which was normally used for making public announcements, and declared that he was giving a concert in honor of St. Andrew and his own birthday. The platform elevated Peter's voice, making his singing audible to additional residents who lived farther from the town square. At this point, someone summoned Aldrich Jr., who had the authority to arrest people for disturbing the peace, though disturbing the peace was not clearly defined in medieval law and was applied based on the judgment of law enforcement officials, which meant that Aldrich had considerable discretion in deciding whether Peter's behavior warranted arrest. Aldrich arrived at the town square at approximately 12:15 a.m. and found Peter still singing on the platform, surrounded by a crowd of approximately 20 residents who were watching the performance with expressions ranging from mild amusement to obvious irritation. Aldrich assessed the situation and determined that Peter was too intoxicated to reason with and was causing enough disturbance to justify arrest. The arrest was accomplished without violence because Peter was too intoxicated to resist effectively, and Aldrich was experienced in arresting drunk people, which was a regular part of medieval law enforcement. Peter was escorted to jail, where he was placed in the other cell and allowed to sleep off his intoxication. However, when Peter woke the following morning, he discovered that his arrest had created a legal problem beyond simple public intoxication. During his singing performance, he had improvised lyrics that included unflattering references to Sir Geoffrey, comparing Sir Geoffrey's appearance to various farm animals and suggesting that Sir Geoffrey's mother had engaged in inappropriate relationships with traveling merchants. And so, as the final candle flickered out in the cold corridor of the Mundaneshire jail and the faint smell of boiled beef faded into the porous limestone, the year 1247 drew to its deeply unremarkable conclusion. No songs were sung, no lessons were learned, no miracles occurred, just 6 prisoners digesting salted meat and stale reflections beneath walls that neither judged nor remembered. Outside, the townspeople carried on, equally unaware that a video, centuries later, would transform their most forgettable Christmas into 2 hours of unforgettable monotony. Sleepy Noel, whose expression never changed, nodded one last time. Not out of emotion, not out of meaning, but because that's simply what Sleepy Noel does on day 31, and perhaps that is the greatest message of all. Not every story needs purpose. Not every Christmas needs magic. Sometimes surviving boredom is itself a miracle. Merry Christmas. Or rather, a statistically probable conclusion to December, which is, all things considered, just fine.